News of what happened spread through the galaxy faster than lightspeed communications, and every species with the ability to receive broadcasts heard about the human captain who had stopped the Void Serpent with nothing but emotional signals. And suddenly humanity went from being the new kids in galactic society to being the species everyone wanted to talk about. Jake spent 3 days in constant communication with the creature and teaching it about human civilization and the different species they had met. And the concept of peaceful coexistence and the Void Serpent absorbed everything with what could only be described as eager curiosity, like a student who had been waiting their whole life for school to finally start. Linda worked around the clock, developing a translation interface that could help other species communicate with the creature, and she was running on coffee and determination and barely sleeping, but her eyes shone with the excitement of discovery, because she was literally writing the book on how to talk to dimensional beings, and every xenobiologist in the galaxy was going to be studying her work for centuries. The constellation began moving back toward human space, and the Void Serpent followed alongside the ship like a massive pet that had finally found its person, and Jake could feel the creature's presence at the edge of his mind at all times now, like a constant companion who never spoke but was always there. Ben had finally accepted that they weren't going to die, and had started making jokes about Jake being a cosmic dog whisperer, and the crew relaxed enough to go back to their normal duties, though everyone kept glancing at the view screens to make sure the massive creature was still there and still peaceful. The Galactic Council called an emergency session and demanded Jake appear before them to explain himself and answer charges of reckless endangerment and violation of about 17 different protocols, and Jake agreed to attend, but insisted on doing it remotely because he wasn't leaving the Void Serpent alone when their connection was still new and fragile. Some species celebrated what Jake had done and called it a miracle of diplomacy, and proof that peaceful solutions were always possible if you were willing to try, and the Valara delegation sent official thanks, because their homeworld would have been in the Void Serpent's path if Jake hadn't stopped it. Others feared what this meant for the balance of power in the galaxy, because if humans could communicate with the most dangerous entity in known space, then what stopped them from using that power to dominate everyone else? And several military leaders, including Supreme General Vex of the Tarkonian Empire, demanded that the creature be recaptured and studied and controlled before it became a weapon in human hands. Jake listened to the arguments with growing frustration because they were missing the entire point, and he finally interrupted the council chamber and explained in simple terms that the Void Serpent wasn't a weapon or a tool or a threat, and it was a living being that deserved respect and understanding. And yes, it was powerful, but that didn't mean it should be feared or controlled. Vex was a massive warrior from a species that had built their entire civilization on military conquest, and his forearms gestured aggressively as he argued that power without control was dangerous, and that the creature had destroyed 14 civilizations and killed trillions, and nothing Jake said could change that history. Jake agreed that the past couldn't be changed, but explained that the Void Serpent had acted out of confusion and pain, not malice. And now that it understood there were beings in the universe who wanted to communicate, not fight, it was choosing peace, and that choice should be respected and honored, not punished. The debate went on for hours, and Jake felt the Void Serpent's confusion through their connection, because the creature didn't understand why everyone was so afraid when it was trying so hard to be peaceful, and Jake had to keep sending soothing emotions to prevent it from getting distressed. Linda finished her translation interface and tested it by having Jake ask the Void Serpent simple questions, and the creature's responses came through as feelings first, and then the interface converted them into words that other species could understand, and it wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Meanwhile, in the Tarkonian Empire's Central Command, Vex was gathering a battle fleet in secret and telling his officers that they had a brief window of opportunity to capture the Void Serpent while it was distracted by its new human friends, and if they acted fast, they could have the most powerful weapon in the galaxy under their control. The fleet consisted of 30 warships with enough firepower to crack a planet, and Vex had spent his entire career preparing for battles exactly like this, and he believed completely that military might was the only true power in the universe, and everything else was just pretending. Jake was on the observation deck talking to the Void Serpent through their emotional connection, when Linda burst in with her tablet and a horrified expression, and she showed him the sensor readings that indicated a massive fleet approaching on an intercept course, and the energy signatures matched Tarkonian military vessels. Ben activated combat protocols without being asked, and the crew scrambled to their stations, and Jake felt his stomach drop, because this was exactly what he had been afraid of, and if the Tarkonians attacked, then everything he had built with the Void Serpent would shatter like glass. Jake immediately broadcast warnings to the approaching fleet, and explained that any attack would be seen as aggression against both humanity and the Void Serpent, and begged them to reconsider. But Vex ignored every message and kept his ships on course because he believed the humans were bluffing, and that the creature could be taken if they struck hard and fast. The Void Serpent sensed the approaching danger, and its energy patterns began shifting toward the angry reds and violent purples that meant it was preparing to defend itself, and Jake could feel the creature's old instincts rising up because it had learned over billions of years that when things approached with hostile intent, you either fought or died. Jake ran to the communications console and opened every channel he had, and broadcast to the Void Serpent with everything he had, and he sent feelings of calm and restraint and mercy, and he showed it images of Tarkonian civilians and families and children who had nothing to do with their military's decisions. The fleet dropped out of hyperspace directly in front of them, and 30 warships lit up their weapons arrays, and Vex gave the order to fire, and energy beams that could destroy cities lanced through space and struck the Void Serpent's form. The creature roared with pain and confusion, and its massive body writhed as the weapons tore at its energy field, and Jake felt every hit like it was striking his own flesh, and he screamed for them to stop, but the Tarkonians kept firing. Ben shouted that they needed to jump away immediately, but Jake refused to leave, and Linda was crying as she watched her instruments show the Void Serpent's distress levels climbing, and the creature wanted to strike back, and it could destroy that entire fleet. Without effort, but it was holding back because Jake had asked it to. The Void Serpent's energy field exploded outward and surrounded both the constellation and the Tarkonian fleet in a sphere of pure power, and the instruments went dead, and the lights flickered, and everyone on the bridge thought they were about to die. Jake stood at the viewport with his hand against the glass and whispered to the creature with tears streaming down his face, and he showed it mercy and compassion and restraint, and asked it to trust him one more time, even though everything in its ancient instincts was screaming to defend itself. The sphere of energy pulsed, and the Tarkonians fired again and again, and the Void Serpent absorbed every shot and held position and didn't attack, and Jake felt the creature's incredible effort as it fought against billions of years of survival. Programming because a human it barely knew had asked it to choose peace. Vex couldn't believe what he was seeing and ordered his ships to increase firepower, but nothing they did seemed to hurt the creature anymore. And slowly he began to realize that it wasn't defending itself because it couldn't, but because it was choosing not to. The Void Serpent's energy field contracted, and it moved to position itself between the constellation and the Tarkonian fleet like a shield, and its body pulsed with controlled power. And the message was clear to everyone watching because it could destroy them all right now, but it wouldn't, because Jake had taught it that there was another way. The emergency signal came through at 3 in the morning, and Jake Morrison was already awake when it happened, because he never slept well in deep space anyway, and the red lights that flooded his cabin made his heart race faster than usual as he pulled on his uniform and rushed to the bridge of the constellation, where his crew was already gathering with worried faces and shaking hands that told him this was worse than the usual problems they dealt with on research missions in the outer sectors of known space. The main view screen showed the Galactic Council chamber and dozens of alien species arguing in their various languages, while the translation software struggled to keep up with all the overlapping voices, and Jake could see the fear in their eyes, even across the vast distance of space that separated them, because fear looked the same no matter what planet you came from, or how many arms you had, or what color your skin might be. Ben Tucker stood beside the communications console with his jaw clenched tight, and when he looked at Jake, there was something in his expression that made the captain's stomach drop, because Ben had been his first officer for 6 years, and Jake had never seen him look scared before today. And whatever was happening out there in the darkness between stars was bad enough to shake a man who had survived 3 different wars and countless dangerous missions without breaking a sweat. The council spokesman was a tall, thin creature from Valara Prime with blue skin and 4 eyes that blinked independently, and when it spoke, the translation came through clear and cold as winter ice, telling them that the Void Serpent had broken free from its containment field in the Krell Nebula, and was moving toward inhabited systems at speeds that defied their best calculations and would reach the colony worlds within days unless something could stop it. Jake had heard stories about the Void Serpent since his academy days when instructors used it as an example of things humanity should avoid at all costs, and the creature was supposed to be contained and sleeping and safely tucked away in a region of space that no one visited anymore. But now it was loose and angry and heading straight for billions of innocent people who had no way to defend themselves against something that had destroyed 14 entire civilizations before the current Galactic Council even existed. Linda Harris burst onto the bridge carrying 3 data tablets, and her hair was a mess because she had obviously just rolled out of bed, but her eyes were bright with the kind of excited energy she always got when facing an impossible scientific problem, and she started talking before anyone could ask her what she was doing there, explaining that she had been studying the Void Serpent for years as part of her xenobiology research and had found something interesting in the old records that everyone else had missed. The creature was 15 kilometers long according to the most recent scans, and it moved through space like a living shadow that fed on stellar radiation and left dead worlds behind wherever it passed, and every weapon ever fired at it had failed, because conventional physics didn't seem to apply to something that existed partially outside normal space and time, and the best military minds in the galaxy had decided that containment was the only option, since they couldn't kill it and couldn't communicate with it and couldn't understand what it wanted. Linda spread her tablets across the navigation console and pulled up ancient records from races that no longer existed, and pointed at patterns in the data that looked like random noise to everyone else. But she insisted they were something more, and Jake trusted her instincts because she had never been wrong about this kind of thing before, even when her theories seemed crazy at first glance. The patterns were energy frequencies that the Void Serpent had emitted during every recorded encounter, and most researchers had assumed they were just byproducts of the creature's biology, or maybe weapon signatures or navigation signals, but Linda had run them through every analysis program she could find and discovered something that made her hands shake when she explained it to the crew standing around her in the dim red emergency lighting of the bridge. The frequencies matched emotional patterns, and not just any emotions, but specific feelings like pain and loneliness and confusion and fear. And Linda believed the Void Serpent wasn't attacking worlds out of malice or hunger, but because it was searching for something and crying out in a language that no one had bothered to learn because they were too busy being afraid of it and shooting at it and trying to lock it away where they wouldn't have to think about it anymore. Jake made a decision that would either save billions of lives or get his entire crew killed, and probably both at the same time. And he ordered the Constellation to change course and intercept the Void Serpent's path, instead of running away like every other ship in the sector was doing, and Ben looked at him like he had lost his mind and started to protest. But Jake cut him off with a gesture and explained that if Linda was right, then they had a chance to stop this without anyone dying. The crew didn't like it, and several of them questioned the order out loud, which was against protocol. But Jake didn't blame them because he was asking them to fly straight toward the most dangerous thing in the known galaxy, based on a theory from a scientist who specialized in studying dead civilizations and energy patterns that might mean nothing at all. Linda worked non-stop for the next 18 hours, while the Constellation moved through hyperspace toward the nebula, and Jake watched her through the window of her lab as she ran simulation after simulation and filled 3 whiteboards with equations and diagrams that looked like abstract art and drank enough coffee to kill a smaller person. The sensors picked up the Void Serpent 2 days later, and it was even bigger than the record suggested, and its body pulsed with colors that hurt to look at directly, and waves of energy that made their instruments go haywire and caused headaches. Among half the crew and Jake stood on the observation deck watching it move through space like a dark river that flowed between the stars. Ben came to stand beside him and asked quietly what the plan was, and Jake admitted he didn't have one yet except to get close enough to try communicating, and hoped that Linda's theory about emotional frequencies was correct, and hoped that the creature wouldn't destroy them the moment it noticed their presence. The Void Serpent was heading directly toward a colony system called New Boston that housed 3 billion people, and they had 72 hours before it would reach the outer planets and start tearing through their defenses like tissue paper. And the Colonial Defense Force was evacuating as many people as they could, but there wasn't enough time, and there weren't enough ships, and most of those people were going to die unless something changed. Jake ordered all weapon systems powered down, and that nearly caused a mutiny because it went against every survival instinct and military protocol ever written. But he insisted and explained that if they approached the creature with active weapons, It would see them as a threat and react accordingly, and their only chance was to come in peace and try to make it understand that they wanted to help, not hurt. The constellation moved into position directly in the Void Serpent's path, and Jake could feel the vibrations through the deck plates as the massive creature drew closer and closer until it filled every view screen and blocked out the stars, and he thought about his family back on Earth and wondered if they would understand why he had done this. The Tarkonian fleet stopped firing and drifted in space surrounded by the Void Serpent's energy field, and Vex stared at his tactical displays trying to understand what had just happened, because every military theory he knew said that a cornered predator always fought back, but this creature had chosen restraint instead. Jake collapsed into his command chair and his hands were shaking, and he could feel the Void Serpent's exhaustion through their connection, because holding back against every instinct had taken enormous effort, and the creature needed reassurance that it had done the right thing. He broadcast feelings of pride and gratitude and friendship, and the Void Serpent responded with what Linda's interface translated as relief, mixed with uncertainty, because it still didn't fully understand why Jake wanted it to spare beings that had hurt it, but it trusted him enough to try. The Galactic Council exploded into chaos, and dozens of species were shouting at once, and some demanded Vex be arrested for unauthorized military action, while others argued that the Tarkonians had every right to defend themselves against a proven threat, and the whole thing devolved into accusations and counter-accusations that went nowhere. Jake requested permission to speak, and the council chamber went silent, because everyone wanted to hear what the human who had tamed the Void Serpent would say, and he stood before the cameras looking exhausted but determined. He explained in simple, clear terms that the galaxy had a choice to make, and they could continue treating the Void Serpent as a monster that needed to be contained or destroyed, or they could recognize it as what it truly was, which was a lonely ancient being that wanted connection, not conflict. Jake proposed something unprecedented, and he suggested that humanity take responsibility for maintaining the relationship with the Void Serpent, and in exchange for companionship and understanding, the creature would help protect the galaxy from threats that conventional military power couldn't handle. The council chamber erupted again, and half the species present thought it was a brilliant solution, while the other half feared it would give humans too much power and influence, and several delegates argued that no single species should have that kind of relationship with something so dangerous. Vex withdrew his fleet and returned to Tarkonian space in humiliation, because he had fired everything he had at the Void Serpent, and it hadn't fought back, and everyone in the galaxy now knew that the creature was choosing peace, not because it was weak, but because it was strong enough to choose. Linda spent the next few weeks refining her translation interface and teaching other xenobiologists how to use it, and soon dozens of species were able to have limited communication with the Void Serpent, though none of them seemed to have the same deep connection that Jake had established. The creature stayed close to the constellation and followed them back toward human space, and Jake maintained constant communication and taught it about Earth and human history and culture, and the Void Serpent was endlessly curious about everything, from music to cuisine to the way humans formed families. News arrived of a dimensional rift opening near the galactic core, and the report said it was growing larger every day and threatening to tear apart reality itself, and the council's best scientists had tried everything they knew to close it, but nothing worked because the physics involved were beyond current understanding. The council was in emergency session again, and this time they looked desperate, because if the rift continued expanding, it would eventually consume entire star systems, and there was nothing any species could do about it with their current technology. Jake was in his quarters sleeping for the first time in days when Ben woke him with the news, and he stumbled to the bridge still half asleep and watched the images of the rift that showed a tear in space that looked like someone had cut through the fabric of reality with a knife. Linda was already analyzing the data, and she explained that the rift existed across multiple dimensions, which meant conventional methods wouldn't work, because they were trying to fix something that operated by rules they didn't understand. Jake felt an idea forming, and he reached out to the Void Serpent through their connection and asked if it could see the dimensional rift, and the creature responded with curiosity because yes, it could see the tear, and it hurt to look at, because the rift was wrong in a way that even the Void Serpent found disturbing. He asked carefully if the creature thought it could fix the rift, and the Void Serpent sent back confusion, because it had never tried to repair something like this before. but maybe it was possible because it existed partially in those other dimensions, and understood them in ways that purely physical beings never could. The council was debating evacuation protocols when Jake contacted them and offered the Void Serpent's help, and the chamber went silent as everyone processed what he was suggesting, because they would be trusting the most dangerous being in the galaxy to reach into the fundamental structure of reality and manipulate it. Several delegates immediately rejected the idea and argued that letting the Void Serpent anywhere near the rift would only make things worse, but others pointed out that they had no alternatives, and the rift was going to consume everything eventually if they didn't try something. The vote was close, but they approved Jake's proposal by a narrow margin, and gave permission for the Void Serpent to attempt repairing the dimensional rift, with the condition that a fleet of observers would monitor everything and be ready to intervene. If something went wrong, though, no one could explain how they would intervene against a dimensional anomaly. Jake asked the Void Serpent if it was willing to help, and he was careful to phrase it as a choice, not a command, because their entire relationship was built on mutual respect, and the creature couldn't be ordered around like a tool or weapon. The Void Serpent responded with what Linda's interface translated as enthusiasm, mixed with nervousness because it wanted to help its new friend, but wasn't certain it could succeed. And Jake sent back feelings of confidence and support, and explained that trying was what mattered, not succeeding. The constellation and a small fleet of observer ships traveled to the galactic core, and the journey took 2 weeks. And during that time, Jake continued teaching the Void Serpent about cooperation and trust, and the importance of working together to solve problems. When they arrived, the dimensional rift was even larger than the reports had suggested, and it stretched across space like a wound that bled darkness and energy, and Jake could see stars being distorted near its edges as gravity and physics broke down. The observer fleet maintained a safe distance and their instruments recorded everything, while Jake and the Void Serpent approached the rift together, and he could feel the creature's concentration as it examined the tier from multiple dimensional angles simultaneously. The Void Serpent began to work, and its massive form moved in patterns that hurt to watch, because it was operating in dimensions that human eyes weren't designed to perceive, and Jake had to look away several times, because the movements made him nauseous. Linda watched her instruments and reported that the creature was somehow weaving its energy through the dimensions and pulling the edges of the rift back together like someone sewing up a torn piece of fabric, except the fabric was reality itself, and the thread was pure dimensional force. Hours passed, and the Void Serpent never wavered, and Jake could feel the enormous effort it was taking, and he sent constant encouragement and support through their connection, because the creature needed to know it wasn't alone in this. The rift began to shrink, and the observer fleet sent excited messages as their instruments confirmed what everyone could see, which was that the impossible was happening, and the tear in reality was being repaired by a being that everyone had feared and wanted to destroy just weeks earlier. Finally, after 8 hours of constant work, the Void Serpent pulled the last edges of the rift together and sealed them with a pulse of energy that lit up sensors across the entire sector, and the dimensional wound was closed and space returned to normal. The creature was exhausted and its energy patterns flickered weakly, and Jake immediately sent feelings of pride and amazement and gratitude, and told it that it had just saved countless lives and proven itself to everyone who had doubted. The observer fleet erupted in celebration, and species that rarely agreed on anything were united in their awe at what they had just witnessed, and messages flooded in from across the galaxy as news spread that the rift was closed. The Void Serpent moved close to the constellation, and Jake could feel its happiness through their connection because it had helped and been useful, and proven that it could do more than destroy. And for the first time in billions of years, it felt like it had a purpose beyond searching for something it could never find. The Galactic Council convened one final time to vote on Jake's proposal, and the chamber was packed with delegates from every species, and the tension was thick enough to cut, because everyone knew this decision would reshape the political landscape of the entire galaxy. Jake stood before them looking tired but hopeful, and beside him on the view screen was Linda with her translation interface, and behind them both was the Void Serpent visible through the observation windows like a living testament to everything they had accomplished together. The debate lasted for 3 days, and delegates argued about precedent and power and responsibility and fear and hope and everything in between. And Jake listened patiently to all of it, even when some species accused humans of manipulating the situation for their own benefit. On the morning of the fourth day, the vote was called, and Jake held his breath as each species cast their decision, and Ben stood beside him with crossed arms, and Linda watched from the lab with her fingers crossed, and the Void Serpent waited in space, understanding somehow that something important was happening. The results came in slowly, and the count was closer than anyone expected, but when the final tally was announced, humanity had won approval by exactly 3 votes, and Jake felt his knees go weak with relief because they had done it against all odds. The official declaration stated that humanity would serve as caretakers and companions to the Void Serpent, and that the creature would be recognized as a sentient being with rights and protections under galactic law, and in exchange it would assist the Council with threats beyond conventional capabilities, but only if it chose to help. Vex watched from the Tarkonian delegation, and his expression was unreadable, but he stood and formally acknowledged the decision, and later he would tell his officers that he had learned something valuable about the difference between controlling power and earning trust. The celebration on the constellation lasted all night, and the crew drank and laughed and told stories about how they thought they were going to die when the Void Serpent first appeared, and Jake smiled and accepted their congratulations, but mostly, he was just relieved that no one else would try to hurt his friend. Linda was already planning research expeditions to study the Void Serpent properly, and she had requests from universities across the galaxy asking to participate, and she told Jake that they were going to learn more about dimensional physics in the next year than the previous 1,000 years combined. The constellation finally set course for Earth, and Jake was eager to go home after months in deep space, and the Void Serpent followed willingly, and seemed excited about seeing the human homeworld because Jake had told it so many stories about blue oceans and green forests. During the long journey home, Jake taught the creature about human emotions in more depth and explained concepts like love and friendship and family and loss, and the Void Serpent absorbed it all with the patience of something that had waited billions of years and could wait a little longer. Ben came to find Jake one evening and asked if he ever worried about the responsibility they had taken on, and Jake admitted that he worried constantly because they were dealing with something that could destroy planets. But he also believed that giving the Void Serpent a chance was the right thing to do. The creature had proven itself repeatedly, and had chosen peace over violence and cooperation over isolation, and Jake argued that beings should be judged by their choices, not their potential for harm, because otherwise humanity itself would have been feared and rejected by the galaxy centuries ago. Earth came into view after 2 more weeks of travel, and Jake felt his heart swell with emotion because there was nothing quite like seeing your home planet after a long journey, and the blue and white sphere hanging in space looked impossibly beautiful and fragile. The Void Serpent stopped at the edge of the solar system, and its energy patterns showed uncertainty because it had never been to anyone's homeworld before, and didn't want to frighten people, and Jake sent back reassurance and explained that Earth had been warned and was ready to meet their new friend. Space traffic control gave them clearance to approach, and Jake could see dozens of ships maintaining a respectful distance, and news drones recording everything, and somewhere down on the surface his family was watching, and he hoped they understood why he had done what he did. The constellation entered orbit, and Jake stood at the observation deck with Linda and Ben, and they watched as the Void Serpent moved gracefully through space above Earth, and the creature's energy patterns showed something that Linda's interface translated as wonder, because it had seen countless worlds but never one filled with so much life and activity. Messages flooded in from the surface, and most were positive, but some were afraid and demanded the creature be kept away from Earth. And Jake understood their fear, but he also knew that fear was what had caused all the problems in the first place. He broadcast a message to the entire planet and explained in simple terms what had happened, and how the Void Serpent had chosen peace, and how it had saved the galaxy by closing the dimensional rift, and he asked people to give it a chance, the way he had given it a chance. The response was mixed but gradually more accepting, as people saw the creature moving gently through space and not threatening anyone. And children especially seemed fascinated by it, and Jake received thousands of messages from kids asking if they could meet the space monster. Jake requested permission to take a shuttle down to the surface, and he wanted to see his family and sleep in his own bed, and eat real food instead of ship rations. But he also knew that he couldn't stay long because the Void Serpent needed him, and their connection was still new enough that distance made it uncomfortable for both of them. His family met him at the landing site, and his mother hugged him so tight he could barely breathe, and his father shook his hand with tears in his eyes, and his younger sister asked a million questions about the void serpent and whether it was really as big as the news said. They had dinner together that night, and Jake told them stories about Linda's research and Ben's loyalty, and the moment when the Tarkonian fleet had attacked and the void serpent had chosen mercy, and his family listened with wide eyes and growing understanding. His mother asked if he was happy with the choice he had made, and Jake thought about it carefully before answering, and he said he was terrified and proud and exhausted and hopeful all at once because they were doing something that had never been done before, and there was no manual for how to be friends with a dimensional being. Ben called a few hours later and said they were needed back on the ship because the council had received reports of another anomaly in a different sector, and they were requesting the void serpent's assistance, and Jake sighed because he had hoped for more time at home. He said goodbye to his family again and promised to visit more often, though they all knew it was a promise he might not be able to keep, and his mother made him swear to be careful, and his father told him he was proud, and his sister made him promise to bring back more stories. The shuttle lifted off, and Jake watched his family grow smaller below, and he felt the void serpent's presence in his mind like a welcome home, and he realized that home wasn't just a place anymore, but also a connection to something vast and ancient that had chosen to trust him. Linda met him in the corridor and showed him her latest research, and she had discovered that the void serpent was teaching itself human languages by analyzing their broadcasts, and soon it might be able to communicate in actual words instead of just emotions and feelings. Ben was on the bridge preparing for departure, and he greeted Jake with a grin and asked if he was ready for another adventure. And Jake laughed and said he didn't think he had a choice because the universe seemed determined to keep throwing impossible situations at them. The constellation left orbit and the void serpent followed, and together they moved toward the next crisis and the next mystery, and Jake stood at the observation window watching Earth fade behind them and thinking about everything that had changed. A creature that had destroyed civilizations was now protecting them, and a human captain who had been running research missions was now a bridge between species and dimensions, and the galaxy was learning slowly and painfully that the strongest force in the universe wasn't weapons or technology, but the simple act of reaching out to someone different and saying, "I want to understand you." The stars stretched ahead of them, and Jake felt the void serpent's contentment through their connection, and he knew that whatever came next they would face it together, because that was what friends did. And sometimes the most powerful bonds were formed between the most unlikely companions, and somewhere in the endless dark of space, an ancient being that had been alone for billions of years finally felt like it had come home. The crew watched in silence as the void serpent approached, and Jake could hear someone crying quietly at one of the rear stations. And he didn't blame them because they were all probably going to die in the next few minutes. And there was something terrifying about facing death in the cold emptiness of space, where no one would even find their bodies afterward. Ben kept his hand near the emergency jump controls, and Jake knew his first officer would override the weapons lockdown and fight back if the creature attacked. But for now, he was following orders, even though every muscle in his body was tense and ready to move, and his jaw was clenched so tight it must have hurt. Linda ran onto the bridge with her main tablet, and her eyes were wide with discovery, and she shouted over the alarm systems that she had finally cracked the pattern, and Jake motioned for someone to shut off those awful sirens so he could hear what she was saying, because if she had answers, then they needed to hear them before the void serpent decided whether to kill them or ignore them. The energy frequencies weren't just emotional patterns but actual communication attempts, and Linda had run them through an audio processor designed for analyzing planetary atmospheres. And when she played them back, the sounds that came out were like whale songs mixed with thunder and crying children. And somehow the combination created meaning that bypassed language entirely and spoke directly to the part of the brain that understood feelings before words. The void serpent was lonely, and that realization hit Jake like a physical blow, because how could something so massive and powerful and ancient be lonely? And Linda explained that the creature existed partially outside normal space-time, which meant it perceived reality differently than biological beings and had been searching for others like itself for longer than human civilization had existed. Every time it encountered an advanced civilization, it sensed their energy signatures and thought, maybe these were others like itself, and it would reach out trying to communicate. But all it got back was fear and weapons fire and containment fields. And after thousands of years of rejection and pain, it had learned to strike first because everything that moved in space seemed to want to hurt it. Jake understood in that moment what he had to do, and it was either the bravest or stupidest decision of his life, and probably both at once. And he walked to the communications console and told the technician to open all broadcast channels on every frequency the ship could produce, and Linda grabbed his arm and asked what he was doing, and he said he was going to talk to it. Ben protested and said they didn't have a translation matrix for emotional frequencies. And Jake smiled sadly and replied that humans had been communicating with emotions since before they had language, and every parent who ever soothed a crying baby and every friend who ever comforted someone in grief knew how to speak this language even if they didn't realize it. The communications officer opened all channels, and Jake stood in front of the pickup sensors and closed his eyes and thought about loss and understanding and peace, and he let those feelings fill him completely until they were all he was. And then he broadcast them outward on every frequency, knowing that somewhere in all that noise the Void Serpent might hear something it recognized. Nothing happened for 30 seconds that felt like 30 years. And then the massive creature stopped moving, and for the first time in recorded history, the Void Serpent simply held position in space without attacking or fleeing or doing anything, except existing in that moment, and the entire bridge crew held their breath waiting to see what would happen next. Linda's instruments started going crazy with readings, and she reported that the creature's energy patterns were changing and becoming less chaotic and more organized, and it looked like it was trying to process what it had just received, and maybe even attempting to respond in kind. The Void Serpent's body shifted colors from angry reds and violent purples to softer blues and greens, and Jake felt something touch his mind, like a gentle hand on his shoulder. And it wasn't words or images, but pure sensation. And he knew without knowing how he knew that the creature was curious and cautious and desperately hoping that this wasn't another trick or trap. Jake broadcast again, and this time he added layers of meaning to his emotional signal, and he showed the creature through feeling alone that he wanted to understand, and that he meant no harm, and that he knew what it was like to be alone in the dark and searching for connection that never came. The Galactic Council had been watching from their safe distance, and their communications started flooding in, demanding to know what Jake was doing and ordering him to retreat immediately because he was going to get everyone killed. But he ignored them all and kept his focus on the massive being in front of him that was slowly moving closer to the constellation. Ben's hand moved toward the jump controls again, but Jake shook his head, and his first officer's hand stopped and trembled in midair, and the whole bridge crew watched as 15 kilometers of living energy approached their tiny ship like a curious cat investigating something new and potentially dangerous. The Void Serpent's energy field reached out and touched the hull of the constellation, and Jake could feel the vibrations through the deck plates and up through his legs and into his chest, and it felt like standing near a massive engine, or maybe like standing next to someone with a very loud heartbeat. Linda reported that the creature wasn't attacking but investigating, and it was running what looked like scans over their hull and learning about their ship and maybe about them as biological beings. And Jake walked to the observation deck with Linda following close behind, and he stood before the massive viewport as the Void Serpent's form filled his entire field of vision. He placed his hand against the cold glass, and the creature's energy pulsed in response, and Linda gasped as her instruments showed something impossible, because the Void Serpent's energy pattern was synchronizing with Jake's heartbeat and matching the rhythm of his breathing, and it was mimicking him the way a child might mimic a parent, or the way someone learning a new language might repeat sounds they heard. Jake closed his eyes and let more images flow through his emotional broadcast, and he showed the creature earth and green forests and blue oceans and cities full of people living their lives, and he showed it connection and friendship and the bonds between living things that made life worth living even when it was hard. The Void Serpent responded with its own images that weren't really images but impressions of feelings, and Jake saw through the creature's memory things that hurt his mind to comprehend, and he saw the beginning of everything in the companions it had lost in the endless search through cold space, looking for others like itself and never finding them. It had been alone for billions of years, and that kind of loneliness was impossible for a human mind to fully grasp. But Jake understood enough to feel tears running down his face, and he whispered not with words, but with pure intention, that it didn't have to be alone anymore. The creature made a sound that translated through Linda's equipment as something between relief and joy, and sorrow all mixed together. And it was the sound of someone who had given up hope, finding unexpected kindness, and Jake felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders because he had just made a promise to something older than his entire species. The Galactic Council was still demanding explanations and threatening consequences, but Jake ignored them because he was having a conversation that transcended politics and fear, and everything that made civilizations build walls instead of bridges. And he knew that nothing would ever be the same after this moment. The Void Serpent pulled back slightly and its energy pattern stabilized into something that looked almost peaceful, and Linda reported that it was waiting, and Jake understood that the creature was giving them time to decide what came next and trusting that these strange biological beings wouldn't betray that trust the way everyone else had.